This is a presentation that I gave a couple of weeks ago at the Caméra-Stylo Conference, which is a fantastic little conference run every couple of years by the Sydney Literature and Cinema Network. I want to thank the organisers of the conference for inviting me up and for the fantastic couple of days that I and everyone had up there. This is the presentation that I gave, and it's called From Caméra-Stylo to Prompt-Stylo, Co-Hallucination and Entangled Inscription with Generative Artificial Intelligence. I'd like to begin by acknowledging that we gather today. I am here today on stolen land. The work of this paper was done on the unceded lands of the Woiwurrung and Bunurong language groups of the Eastern Kulin Nation in Naarm, or so-called Melbourne, and the Caméra-Stylo conference itself took place on the country of the Wallumattagal clan of the Darug Nation. I'd like to pay my respects to elders past and present, and to acknowledge any Aboriginal people who may be watching this presentation. Always was, always will be Aboriginal land. AI is going to take all of our jobs. It will replace creativity. It will ruin our capacity to think critically. It will ruin our ability to use our brains and to imagine. It will, it will. The future is coming. We're not ready. Why are we waiting for disruption? Why are we waiting for the apocalypse when, if you just look around, it's been and gone? The band is warming up. The robots have taken to the floor, so we may as well learn some of the steps. If AI has ruined, transformed, and evolved human creativity, how and what is the result? The answers, at least for me, lie in unexpected places. For if you look back to the promises of another transformative technology, namely the cinema, you're given some wonderful precedents for our current moment and how we might begin to live and work and create within it. In particular, I propose the figure of Prompt-Stylo, a riff on the title of the symposium, perhaps perhaps cheap, perhaps cheeky. The Prompt-Stylo for me is an interface, an interactive and dynamic nexus of entangled authorship, co-hallucination, and automated cinematic inscription. A theoretical needle, a diagnostic tool, and a means of creating with generative AI. I will demonstrate that the Prompt-Stylo, writing or inscribing meaning with the AI prompt, is not as far removed from Caméra-Stylo as it may seem, nor indeed from many of the early promises or dreams of cinema. The fundamental problem of the cinema, wrote Alexandre Astruc, quote, is how to express thought, end quote. Astruc used a conceptual model to imagine a cinema that was liberated from the visual, from the need to record and represent, from narrative. This was cinema as inscription, using audiovisual tools to sketch, to carve, to mark, to write. Quote, a means of writing just as flexible and subtle as written language, end quote. Quote, I am a builder, wrote Vertov. Quote, I've placed you, whom I have created today, in an extraordinary room which did not exist until just now when I also created it. End quote. Vertov's kino eye, more perfect than the human eye, was his vehicle for this cinematic bringing into being, a machinic manifestation into which the viewer is also created. Astruc and Vertov imagined a mechanical, machinic, non-human, non-representational cinema, an automated cinematic engine that proffered a machinic imaginary and subjectivity, an entanglement of technology, perception, and affect. Film, like few other media before or since, drew so many thinkers and practitioners to theorize and speculate towards its purest form. Whether Caméra-Stylo or kino eye, Epstein's photogeny, Eisensteinian montage and ecstasy, Balaz's visible man, the rendering visible once again the bodily gesture and the facial expression through cinema. Theories of early cinema worked to understand or dissolve the boundaries between media forms, to bring layfolks, practitioners, and theorists and intellectuals together around big ideas of creative form, function, and expression, and to imagine new modes of expression through the integration of the new technology. Generative AI, for better or worse, is causing us to rediscover these foundational concerns about human-machine creative expression, now mediated through cultural memory processed as statistical possibility. The Caméra-Stylo has become Prompt-Stylo, a machinic tool that composes through inference, not exposure. In this section, I'll briefly run through a kind of etymology for the Prompt-Stylo, thus defining the parameters for a praxical, that is to say, theoretically inflected mode of engagement with technology, what I've come to call a ritual techniques. This practical play falls under the broad umbrella of creative critical methods, but specifically ritual techniques are small, repeatable experiments that drive toward poesis or estrangement. The goal of a ritual technique is to increase understanding and interpretability of technical systems, and potentially also to creatively generate, reintegrate, or remix the results. Ritual techniques are a kind of being or staying with, per Donna Haraway. Staying with is a worlding practice where the researcher enacts a kind of thinking that, quote, enlarges, even invents the competencies of all the players, including herself, such that the domain of ways of being and knowing dilates, expands, adds both ontological and epistemological possibilities, proposes and enacts what was not there before, end quote. It's an attunement to thought and creativity with technology that casts technical systems as ambient presences rather than necessarily a core tool or extension of the body. Derived from these diverse strands, the ritual technique is less a script or blueprint to be enacted or built, but more perhaps of a score. Diagrammatic, affective, interpretive, generative. In the case of the Prompt-Stylo, the ritual technique inscribes intention into latent space, drawing on a machinic memory trained on cinematic form. For example, you may prompt for a single frame of insert film title here, but restaged in a different time period, culture, style, or material. You might prompt for frame number, insert random number here, from a particular film or from a made-up film entirely, maybe from a particular era or decade. You may describe a moving image, for example, a particular shot, and have the media generator render it as a single still image. Working with Prompt-Stylo as ritual technique reveals three fundamental dynamics at play in AI generation. Dynamics that function both as analytical tools for understanding synthetic media and as principles, design principles perhaps, for more thoughtful AI co-creation. Agency, hallucination, and recursion, these form a theoretical triad, a method for analysis and commentary, but also a schema for practice, which I'll return to shortly. How does generative AI reconfigure creative intention? Creative intent is not outsourced, nor is it no longer sovereign to humanity. This is a reductive view born from fear and perhaps a little insecurity. Using genAI in creative work rarely saves time. This has been thoroughly proven not just by myself, but by my students and those of my colleagues working in this space, or at least brave enough to experiment. Very little time is saved with creative use of AI, and often time is lost. However, These questions are often accompanied by what Stuart Bender calls, quote, an ill-defined yet elitist view of human creativity, end quote. The office worker battling under the cruel oppression of capitalism can be excused, perhaps, for using ChatGPT to send an email, but the supposedly time-liberated creative using Midjourney to make a film is somehow inauthentic or disingenuous. Both examples are fundamentally reductive and flawed, speaking to the complete lack of nuance accompanying this mainstream discourse. Bender uses the rubric of meaningful work to explore the affordances of both human and machinic creativity, detailing examples where these capabilities have been effectively combined to produce high quality, often lauded creative outputs. This isn't necessarily about ceding creative control or agency, but rather leveraging the capabilities of a given technology to aid in the overall creative vision, in no less a way than a director might defer to the expertise of their cinematographer or editor. In the case of film editing, there are embodied rhythms and movements innate to the practice that materialize in the pacing of the edit. This idea is further articulated in part by Walter Murch, but more comprehensively and articulately by Karen Perlman in her book Cutting Rhythms. Even in the shift to digital editing, the editor may use keyboard shortcuts or specially designed hardware, plugins, or interfaces to optimize their workflow. In a similar way, working creatively with AI can become a rhythmic embodied collaboration, switching between browser tabs or tools, daisy chaining different automations and generations together. Even when just using text-based tools, the results and outcomes emerge from a kind of negotiation, coaching, co-development. It can become somewhat unconscious. And natural language means it feels like a collaboration with the same affective qualities. It's a kind of parlay with the user pushing and guiding, extracting what's meaningful, verifying what they need to. Prompting thus is a kind of co-enunciation, thought to text to output. The wonderful word hallucination, which you can see here, Leonardo struggled with, has been co-opted by AI zealots and detractors alike, used unironically despite its innate anthropomorphism to describe generative AI's propensity to produce factually incorrect information or unprompted, unusual, or unexpected visual outputs. Technology companies have worked feverishly to ameliorate the worst of this behavior within their models, particularly as various sectors such as education, media, and even law scramble to deal with the impact of synthetic sources and data. However, it is just this hallucination that allows AI to be generative at all. Hallucination isn't a bug, but is rather the core feature of this current stage of generative AI. The genAI model takes in the user's prompt, breaks it up into digestible parts, otherwise known as tokenization, and then matches the parts with the embeddings that it's been trained on. These embeddings can be text, image, or video elements that have been cast across a multidimensional mathematical area called the latent space. This is a statistical space where concepts, objects, descriptions, known as latent vectors, are mapped out. The tokenized prompt is checked against this latent space to look for vectors that match, and then the output is generated. Essentially, every output is the model's best guess against the natural language that you're using to ask for what you want. This is to say that the operations that make generative AI give good or correct responses are precisely the same ones that result in less desirable or hallucinated outcomes. The statistical operations at play in generative AI models resemble, in some ways, older theories of the production of meaning in cinema, be it the Kuleshov effect or Eisenstein's dialectical montage. Montage, though, involves the sequencing of discrete elements. Through this juxtaposition, meaning emerges in the mind of the viewer. But in genAI, Outputs are generated through statistical inference rather than any kind of considered assembly. Image generation, for instance, is an iterative process, a repeated spawning, denoising, resolution over several stages. GenAI models don't know shots blocking continuity. They work with clusters of correlations, aka the visual textual entanglements known as embeddings. There is no authorship or agency in AI generation, and therefore no authorial logic. Rather, the plausibility of the outcome, at least in the user's mind, is a result of the distribution of production across weights, prompts, and training data. Where montage cuts, AI diffuses in all sorts of ways. In the parlance of computer science, recursion is the process of defining a problem in terms of a similar, smaller version of itself. This is different to iteration, where a script or program loops through the same code until a condition is met. For example, x equals 0, and then x equals x plus 1 until x equals 10. Iteration is more efficient computationally because it's a simple rinse and repeat process. Recursion is an elegant means of tracing through a process to a natural conclusion, such as complex algorithms that need to be broken down to be solved. However, recursion is more computationally taxing, and without adequate organization, a recursive function could result in what's called stack overflow. Diffusion image generation is an iterative process. The noising and denoising process repeats a predefined number of times. This is either set internally by the model developer or explicitly by the user. The model has no condition for completion. It will just keep running the reverse diffusion process for its set number of steps. We could settle on this, then, for instance, that the process of generation is iterative, but that the training of these models is recursive in that all models are trained on existing sets of data, be they curated or algorithmically produced. Eric Salvaggio writes that every AI image functions as an infographic of the model's dataset. Taking this further, Andreas Ervik offers that generation models constitute a kind of machinic imaginary comprised of multiple views from nowhere. Visuals rendered without a real-world referent, drawn from an agglomeration of images, concepts, conventions, and styles from the human collective imaginary. Ervik writes that this collective imaginary already exists, quote, in a feedback mechanism with media, which act at once as reservoirs and prompts for it, end quote. Reservoirs and pumps, same. Ervik's machinic imaginary, thus, is a way of conceptualizing how AI accesses, influences, and reconfigures cultural memory. AI functions as a recursive medium technology, but as Bolter and Gruson told us nearly 30 years ago, quote, no medium, it seems, can function independently and establish its own separate and purified space of cultural meaning, end quote. Both spectral and alien, both familiar and uncanny, it's neither old nor new media that AI remediates. It's the complete media archive. To jump back, I said that it might be enough that the process of generative AI is iterative, but that the training of the models is recursive. GenAI, in its functions, remediates other media forms and artifacts, but it doesn't train on the techniques or conventions of these forms. It recombines, reconstitutes into unique assemblages. Prompting can also occasion states or outputs that are irrational. These might be called errors, but in this talk it's more productive to refer to them as glitches or glitch states. Recursive prompting with AI leads to a kind of reality collapse, at least for the model. This mirrors the processes of training and generation in some sense, the recasting of a more accurate model of reality, that is, photographs and images with real-world reference, into the latent space, is a diffusion of meaning and indexicality. It does not take much to push the model further into that ungrounded, deterritorialized state. These three dynamics, agency, hallucination, and recursion, offer opportunities to consider both the affects and effects of engaging with generative systems and outputs. Agency allows us to consider the immediate and experiential, the feeling of collaboration in the moment of generation or during the flow of work. Hallucination offers a processual angle. How and from where does meaning emerge in statistical operations? And recursion gives us two modes. Firstly, how cultural memory is recast and recalibrated through computation and generation. And secondly, how prompting itself is a recursive practice, triggering the machinic imaginary to spawn new calibrations and permutations based on training data. The Prompt-Stylo is a conceptual model for understanding AI-generated media as a contemporary evolution of Alexandre Astruc's Caméra-Stylo, a means of writing or inscribing with machines that composes through statistical inference rather than optical exposure. The model functions as a theoretical lens for considering how AI fulfills and perverts the dreams of early cinematic scholarship, a diagnostic tool for approaching or evaluating the three entangled dynamics of AI generation: distributed agency, productive hallucination, and cultural recursion, and finally, a practical method activated via ritual technique for working with and against AI systems through experimental embodied engagement that emphasizes poiesis and estrangement over optimization and efficiency. A bold move, I know, to position a technology as fundamentally cinematic, and I know others may be pilloried for doing the same, but I figured that at Caméra-Stylo, of all places, such a positioning would probably be fairly safe. More than that, though, the Prompt-Stylo is a provocation to consider and develop new forms of critical creative literacy, theory, and practice for navigating not just generative AI, but the other platforms, technologies, forms, and mythologies that define this post-apocalyptic media landscape. These should be skills, practices, and engagements that facilitate critical understanding and practical knowledge rather than blanket resistance or blind acceptance. Ethical co-creation, latent space literacy, and hallucinating with care. A dance with the machines, if you like, learned and structured, but fluid and interpretable. Thank you.